Today we're going to look at Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, Mishna 10, page 526 in the Green Siddur. And before, as usual, we read the Mishnah and the translation by Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, let's just have a little bit of background to the Chachamim, to the sages that we are going to encounter and the context in which they lived. Now, the two sages who are mentioned here are Shemaiah and Avtalion, and the Mishnah we'll look at focuses on Shemaiah. They were the next of the Zugot, of the pairs of scholarly leaders, of sages, and they were the students of Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shattach, whom we encountered in Mishnayot 8 and 9, respectively. Now, they lived in the 1st century BCE. That's, of course, how Jews describe BC. And they lived at a time in the land of Israel when there were rulers such as Yochanan Hyrcanus and Herod. This was a time of great political instability, and it wasn't necessarily an easy time to be a religious leader. The political instability wasn't just amongst the government, but also amongst the Kohanim, amongst the priestly class as well. So the Talmud, for instance, in the volume of Yoma, tells us that one time after the Kohen Gadol was leaving the temple, whereas usually the people would follow him after he had completed his service, especially on Yom Kippur, instead when they saw Shemaiah and Avtalion, they flocked towards these two sages instead, as if to say that these sages who, in a meritocracy, had engendered the tremendous warmth, love, and appreciation of the people for their teachings and personal example, they were becoming the leaders in the eyes of the people rather than the Kohanim. Another very important story about the impact of Shemaiah and Avtalion is also in the volume of Yoma, the very famous account of when Hillel, later to become one of the greatest sages in Jewish history, arrived in the land of Israel and was looking for a place to study, a Bet Midrash. And it was very cold, and in those days, for reasons that perhaps we'll discuss another time, there was an entry fee to get into the Bet Midrash, into the study hall. And Hillel did not have the necessary funds, so instead he lay on top of the Bet Midrash to try and listen through the roof to the deliberations and the teaching going on below. And of course, eventually we know that he was rescued from the cold on the top of the Bet Midrash and was brought inside. But who were the teachers in the Bet Midrash at that time? They were Shemaiah and Avtalion. They were to become two of the most important teachers that Hillel had. So therefore, their significance in inspiring and teaching Hillel is very, very important because of its resonance, not just for Hillel, but of course because of everything else that we learn from Hillel in the Talmudic sources, and of course the discussions on those beyond. So that's just a little bit of background about Shemaiah and Avtalion, people who had to be careful about the political context in which they lived, but people who also were the next chain in the line of tradition stretching all the way back to Moshe at Har Sinai, as we've been describing in our study of Pirkei Avot. So let's look now at Mishnah 10 and see what Shemaiah teaches us. So, Shemaiah v'Avtalion kibelu mehem. Shemaiah and Avtalion received the tradition, as we said, from Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shattach. Shemaiah says, love ehovet hamelacha, love work, usna et harabanut, hate public office, v'al titvadal harashut, and do not become too intimate with the ruling power. Now, on the face of it, this Mishnah seems to be addressed to judges, because the previous two Mishnayot, which we've studied, from Yehuda ben Tabai, Shimon ben Shattach, are also addressed to judges. But as we'll see, these Mishnayot are not entirely or exclusively addressed to judges. First of all, ehovet hamelacha, love work. So the rabbinic sources tell us that work is considered to be a value in and of itself, not just for the important purposes of earning a livelihood, which of course is essential, but also even if a person doesn't necessarily need to do constructive things, and let's define work in, I suppose, its best form as things which are constructive, then a person should try and be involved in work for its own value, because doing so helps to make the world a better place and helps to assist other people. And in a certain sense, any job which doesn't assist another person or make the world a better place is perhaps a job which is not going to endure in any case. So, therefore, if you can find ways to assist and help other people, be they through charitable work, even if one is not working in a sense to earn a living, for whatever reason one might not need to, but if one can find ways to help other people and improve the society around oneself, that is important. One must love these opportunities. And we can see here, again, lessons from Shemaiah and Avtalion, who grew up in a meritocracy, about the importance of graft, of really going for things and making a positive difference. And maybe this is one of the reasons why they were so beloved of the people in their generation. The next thing they say is Sna'et HaRabbanut, that one should, as Rabbi Sachs says, hate public office. Now this, from one perspective, is addressed to judges, because, as the commentaries say, public office can bring about haughtiness in people, can bring about self-serving actions or self-promotion, rather than doing things for the benefit of the community or the broader country and population as a whole. And the Talmud even notes rabbinic disapproval of some of the actions of Joseph when he was towards the end of the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, trying in those famous stories to see if his brothers had repented of the evil which they had done to him previously. The way that he treated them was seen as haughty. And the Talmud censures this and says this is not good for a person and can have positive spiritual, not just negative spiritual, not just negative practical ramifications from it. So therefore, a judge in particular who is put in a position of responsibility should not love that position of responsibility. They should hate the haughtiness which has somehow come about from it and should avoid it at all costs. And I'm sure many of you perhaps will have had the opportunity to meet with someone who you've considered to be great, and perhaps would have felt that part of their greatness is the humility which they are able to display and the way they are able to act. And of course, it's not just judges, though, who are in this position. Anybody who can aspire to any position of responsibility should do so, but not because of any haughtiness or any form of self-promotion or self-serving motivation. Instead, they should be doing it to help those around them in the very best way and improve their society. And again, this reflects, I would suggest, the personalities of Shemaiah and Avtalion, perhaps why they were so beloved by the people around them. And then finally they said, V'al titvada l'rashut, do not become too intimate with the ruling power. Again, this is a lesson which we can see from the earliest days of the Torah. We can see how Abraham negotiated with those around him. We can see how Moshe negotiated with Pharaoh, and Moshe's discussion, or almost his debate in a certain sense, with God before he assumed his position of responsibility. Shemaiah and Avtalion were, we can suggest, facing the twin challenge of the Kohanim, who perhaps were wondering what to do given the popularity of Shemaiah and Avtalion on the one hand, but also of the difficult political situations in which they lived and the difficult political context with the rulers that we have mentioned. So therefore, as the rabbinic sources say, it's important that a person should not become too familiar with the ruling power, because particularly in those times, but even in our times today in certain places, being too familiar can sometimes breed a certain form of contempt or even jealousy. And it's important that that does not happen. First of all, it can be dangerous, but also it can undermine the ability of the community leaders to properly present their case and properly contribute not just to their community but to the broader country around them. So therefore, the sources say, again, particularly thinking about the context of Shemaiah and Avtalion, that one should think carefully about all of one's interactions and use them in the appropriate sense. And perhaps these three particular lessons were at the root of the tremendous spiritual success of Shemaiah and Avtalion, teaching some of our greatest names, inspiring so many thousands and thousands of Jews, and of course continuing to do so through the recording of their words in the Mishna. Have a great day.